I just want to welcome everyone to our final Sociology colloquium talk of the year. It's been a great series so far, and we're really excited to have Dr. Aurini here with us today. We acknowledge the Anishinabek, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenapehoek, and the Attawandan peoples on whose land we gather, live, and work. Just as a quick sort of housekeeping note, after a brief introduction, our speaker will present her work for about 40 minutes, and then my colleague Yoko will moderate a Q&A for the remainder of our time together. During the Q&A, you can use the raise your hand feature in Zoom, or you can send a chat directly to Yoko. And this session, including the Q&A, will be recorded, so folks who weren't able to join us might be able to see the talk at a later time. Well, we are very pleased to welcome today Dr. Janice Aurini, and we're grateful that she's agreed to reschedule her originally scheduled talk from last spring when something happened. I can't remember exactly what it was. Dr. Aurini is an associate professor at the University of Waterloo. She received her PhD from McMaster and then went on to complete a postdoc at Harvard. Her research focuses broadly on education and inequality, and especially on the intersections of parenting and children's education using a range of qualitative methods. For example, she's taking a cross-national comparative look at stratification in higher education systems and parenting. That's the subject of a current SSHRC Insight grant. Lately, she's also looked into COVID-related school closures and the implications for student achievement. You can find her research in outlets like the Canadian Journal of Sociology, Canadian Public Policy, and Sociology of Education, where she's also served on the editorial board. So please join me in thanking and welcoming Dr. Aurini.
Thank you. So now I'm going to share my screen. Thank you for that nice introduction. All right. I'd like to thank the department for inviting me and providing me with this opportunity to present my research. As Patrick noted, I was scheduled for a year ago, and when we canceled it, we just, I guess, assumed that it would just be a couple of weeks and we would be back. Of course, that's not been the case. So I'd like to thank the department for inviting me and for rescheduling. And I'd also like to give a shout out to my co-authors. Oh, I think I'm sorry. I've lost control of my presentation. Just give me a second. Okay. I'd like to give a shout out to my co-authors who I mentioned are on the call today. So today I'm going to talk about data that I initially collected as a postdoc fellow. This work has continued to shape my thinking about the dynamics of parenting and social inequality. And very broadly, these projects examine the macro and meso foundations of parenting, how they influence parenting practices, so what parents actually do, how do they organize their children's time, what kinds of lessons or schooling do they select for their children, and their parenting logics. And by logics, what I mean is how they come to understand and rationalize their decision-making and their parenting philosophy. Within this research context, I'm interested in how stratification, so the degree to which consequential institutions like universities and colleges are stratified via prestige, resources, and of course rewards, and the genealogy of education careers within families or family mobility projects, and how those shape the dynamics of parenting practices and logics. So for today, I'm going to present a slice of data from the US arm of the project, and then talk very briefly about a short grant that I received a couple years ago, last spring, to embark on the next phase of this research. I was supposed to be in the thick of things collecting data, but then of course COVID happened, and I'm currently in a bit of a struggle with research ethics, so we'll see when that next phase will begin. Okay, so for today's presentation, I have two main aims. The first is to add a qualitative dimension to the quantitative research that has looked at sort of the stickiness of intergenerational mobility, which of course is the extent to which people's economic status is related to that of their parents. While social class continues to be the most consistent predictor of education and career outcomes, It's important to note that a middle-class upbringing certainly does not guarantee the same status over a lifetime. And about a third of middle-class children will fall out of the middle. And as Leroux, Evans, and Yee have pointed out, the literature has not sufficiently attended to the way in which middle-class families have a lot of anxiety and uncertainty about their child rearing, and of course how their children will fare. But that's in the middle. The people that I spoke to, the people at the top, are more likely to be stuck there. And the folks that I talked to, the upper middle class parents, also have the resources to fortify what Rees has referred to as a glass floor. You could almost sort of visualize it like a moat that they're able to build or fortify around their children, which protects them from experiencing or the likelihood that they will experience downward mobility in the first place. So I really like this quote here where Cooper says, you know, upper middle class children, they can rely on their families to fund their education, help them buy homes, and ride out a rough patch. And that certainly is the case among the parents that I spoke to. The second aim of today's presentation is to give a little a twist or play on Ralph Turner's work. He coined the term sponsored and conscious mobility. And what his work did was really shift our attention from looking at the extent of mobility to really thinking about how mobility systems can vary. And these terms refer to these ideal type folk norms that can govern stratification systems in societies. In conscious mobility, which is characteristic of the United States as well as Canada, elite status is seen to be a prize that can be won through a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, a lot of effort. And it can foster a degree of optimism among its people about the potential for upward mobility. But at the same time, the lack of predestination can also create a lot of anxiety among parents. Parents can't, you know, pass down their law degree or their business degree. And so the literature on parenting has looked at the various ways in which parents strategize and try to protect their kids from downward mobility and the anxiety that it produces to ensure that their children will maintain their social status. And that's actually what my co-authors and I originally thought we were going to write about when we got together and talked about writing this paper. We thought we were going to write about this sort of fear of falling and parenting anxiety. But once we actually dug into the data, we realized that rather than being fearful or anxious, that our participants actually assume that their children will enjoy a good standard of life no matter what they're doing. So they're subjectively fairly secure about the likelihood of their children's success. And that logic we refer to as predictable stability in this paper. Okay. So just an overview of methods and data, and I'd be certainly happy in the Q&A to talk a little bit more. So I think it's a good place to start is defining in terms of like, what do I mean by middle class? And if you step down to, or upper middle class, sorry, if we step down to the middle class, there's a huge range that has been offered, anywhere from, you know, $45,000 to $120,000 per year. Our Prime Minister has defined the typical middle class as earning about $90,000. And so to paraphrase Wolfgang Lehmann, who's on the call today, they're neither rich nor poor. You know, they have enough income to cover the basics in life, their housing, food, clothing, and so forth. But if we look upward to the kinds of people that I interviewed, I really like this definition by Rose in that, you know, these are folks that have a discretionary income. They can afford homes in nicer neighborhoods. You know, they're not Oprah and Bill Gates kind of rich, but they certainly can eat out at better restaurants and not just on special occasions. Better food, better wine, name brand clothing. They might have someone clean their home. In the case of child rearing, they may have a nanny. They can certainly contemplate private schools and more expensive lessons. And in general, they tend to work in more professional and semi-professional or managerial types of jobs, and then higher levels of education. And this has certainly became part of my selection criteria. So I interviewed, in this case, I'm going to focus on the Boston sample. I'm going to be talking about 26 of the people that I interviewed. And so to pinpoint my sample, what I did is I spent a lot of time looking at census and city and real estate information to try to determine neighborhoods and postal code and zip code areas that had the kinds of people that I was looking for. But within any of these areas, you can have 10 or 20,000 residents who may or may not have the kind of characteristics I was looking for. Namely, I was looking for people with children. So what I did is once I pinpointed a zip code and postal code area that had the characteristics I was looking for, I actually turned to a marketing company, Info USA and Info Canada, and I purchased 500 names in each area. And what I did is I simply selected every 10th name on the list and contacted them via phone, and in some cases secured an interview. And these interviews were transcribed and analyzed in vivo. And I can certainly talk more about that later in the Q&A. So here's just a snapshot of Torontoville and Bostonville. I've got to come up with a better name. Maybe all of you out there can help me come up with a more original name. But you can see that the neighborhoods are reasonably comparable, high levels of BA or higher, very strong family incomes and home values. And I should note that these figures are taken from the time I conducted the interviews, and you would never be able to buy a home for $1 million in Torontoville, the neighborhood that I looked at. I checked the other day, and on average, I think homes are going for $2.8 to $3 million. And I should just note the two pictures in the corner are actually taken from each respective neighborhood. So this is sort of what the look and the feel of the neighborhood is like. Okay, here's a snapshot of the career and education of the people I interviewed and the child's other parent. You can see lots of lawyers, engineers, chartered accountants, doctors. I'll just sort of point out family 6. I can move my mouse. The investment manager here, it wasn't common, but there were a few instances of this. So you can see that this is the mom in this case. She's an investment manager. She has an MBA, which relates presumably to her job, but she's also has an MD, so she's a doctor, but not practicing. So this wasn't, again, not common, but there were certainly parents who had high levels of education in other fields that they weren't currently using those credentials in their job. But again, high levels of education and impressive professional careers. So let's dig into the data a little bit. And so before I get into the context of my data, the substance of my data, I want to provide a little bit of context for the U.S. system. Bryn has characterized the U.S. as a giant missile staging system. And the idea here is that both in terms of the way the system is designed, but as well as the collective imagination, is to try to push people through the education system so they earn not just high school, but into post-secondary. And this is what Rosenbaum has referred to sort of as this college for all ethos or gospel. And it's certainly the education statistics bear this out, that people not only expect, but hope to earn a BA and go on to post-secondary. So we see very impressive attainment levels. Almost all, this is 25 to 29-year-olds, have earned a high school diploma or equivalent, almost half an associate degree, and over a third a bachelor degree. And as Brent and Carabel noted decades ago, when they said that the belief that America was and should remain a land where individuals of ambition and talent could rise as far as their capabilities would take them, has been central to the national identity. However, there's two big points here. Yes, there's been expansion, but also there's a substantial amount of structural differentiation. So if you think about the expansion, it should have, in theory, so this movement from elite to mass to near universal education should have disproportionately benefited lower class children. We should have seen more upward mobility. We should have seen social class gaps close. However, the expansion of the system has primarily occurred at the two-year community college sector, and the growth of enrollments in four-year and private colleges has remained fairly stable. And so when you look at the Harvards and the more selective and even moderately selected institutions, they have not kept pace with demand. So what you have is an oversupply of candidates who desire spots in these schools. And in the US system is also steeply stratified via prestige and resources and, of course, rewards. So here's just some examples of the kinds of endowments that places like Harvard, Yale, Stanford have. And just for fun, I looked up Western and Waterloo in Toronto, and they don't even come close. So the University of Toronto has the most amount of endowment dollars in Canada, but it's not even close to even some of the schools on the bottom of the list in the US. Okay. When we also look at ranking, we can see that a handful of schools have sat at the top of the prestige hierarchy, and some have likened the US system to an academic caste system. And the movement, they don't move very much. They may move like up a slot or two, and certainly administrative schools get very excited if their schools go down. But in general, the same handful of schools have sat at the top of the prestige hierarchy for a long time. I actually had two charts where I had a chart from about 15 years ago to today, and it's the same handful of schools. Certainly these schools are high competition and rewards. So if you look at sort of the on average for tuition and room and board and everything, at about 12,000 at the low end to almost 70,000 at the high end, 70,000 US. They vary in terms of the entrance requirements and certainly the selectivity. And among the Ivy League schools, they only let in about 10%. Some are a little more selective than others or competitive than others, but again, highly selective, very difficult to get into. So high competition, high cost, but also high rewards. And so people like Brent and Stevens have referred to these schools as launch points for the most meaningful careers or network incubators. If you look at, for example, who are the political elite, who make it to the top investment firms on Wall Street, the top law firms, the Supreme Court, they hail from a handful of these institutions. And just sort of on a side note, I think if you look at, for example, like who are the presidents of the United States, again, they come from a handful, often law, but a handful of these schools. And I think the exception is Reagan. I believe he did his degree at Eureka College, which we've probably never heard of. But he would certainly be the exception, the outlier to the rule. So because education is a primary mechanism for the transmission of advantage, college is the focus of much parental anxiety, as Laura Hamilton writes. And Stevens has also noted, Mitchell Stevens has also noted the ideal childbearing in the United States is strongly influenced by the evaluation criteria of elite colleges, prompting a clearly delineated micro-macro reactivity. And in the US, there's this whole like research tradition, this whole literature that really captures this. So again, in this tradition, there's this stratification-oriented parenting literature. We're probably all familiar with terms like intensive parenting, concerted cultivation, to describe how parents organize their time, intervene on schooling matters, and importantly, and this is key to Leroux's work, is how they align their practices with what schools require and what future gatekeepers will think is desirable. Melissa Milkey from the University of Toronto, a terrific sociologist, has talked about status safeguarding. So the ways in which parents do everything possible to ensure that a child's future social and economic status is sustained or improved. Competitive kid capital is another term that's been used. And then Laura Hamilton, again, who's written about this process that doesn't just end at nursery school or high school, but it bleeds into college, and parents act like a personal assistant, helping their children navigate various schooling processes at the college level. And so this is my lame attempt as a joke that, you know, again, right from cradle to, of course, we're probably all familiar with the Varsity Blues scandal. A little bit different here among these parents, but I'll just make a note that Nursery University, if you haven't seen it, it's a terrific documentary. It follows 5 families as they apply to very competitive preschools in New York City. It's old, but it's super. It's a super documentary, and Producing Success, another, again, fantastic ethnography looking at these competitive parenting processes. So how does this context relate to the type of people that I spoke to? Just as part of, I should note, this was not part of my initial interview schedule. It was just sort of like some background chatter to talk to my interviewees about their family background, you know, what kinds of things did their parents do for a living, what kind of schools did they go to. And what I came to learn is that the parents of the people that I spoke to had very impressive educational credentials. Many of them were also had done professional types of jobs. So the sample careers of the parents of my interviewees include, there's a cartographer, doctors, lawyers, professors at university, engineers, an orthodontist. And to place this into context, when my interviewees' parents were younger, young adults, many Americans could not point to people in their social circle that had gone to university, never mind being a university professor or an orthodontist. And so less than 8% of Americans at that time had completed a bachelor degree. And so what I did is I compiled the interviewees and their spouses' education, as well as their parents. And you can see very impressive credentials among the grandparents in my sample, or, you know, the grandparents of the children. You know, lots of BAs, MAs, chartered accountants, dentists, doctors, lots of people with PhDs. So the people, again, this is not part of my selection criteria when I was initially recruiting. I did have a recruitment script. I was looking for certain characteristics among the people that I wanted to interview, but I wasn't expecting them to come from families with such impressive credentials as well. So this was, again, it was a long family history of being involved in education and professional careers. So here's Corinne, and she is a good example of this. My mother-in-law has a BA and also a master's, and my father-in-law has his BA. My father has a PhD in physics and chemistry. My mother has her BA and master's in social work. John's family, that's the husband, is an academic powerhouse. John has his law degree. His great-grandfather founded the Elite Law School, that's a pseudonym. He wrote the definitive book on constitutional law that they still teach at the Ivy League Law School. His mother's side of the family is a legal powerhouse. His mother had such a, if there's an academic elitism in my family, on his mother's side, there's an academic elitism too. My grandmother did a Barnard undergrad. She went to Columbia. My grandfather went to Harvard for his undergrad and got his MBA from Harvard too. His father, so her great-grandfather, has his law degree from Harvard. Okay, So probably not surprisingly, when I asked them, are you worried about downward mobility for your children? Are you concerned? Are you worried that they won't enjoy the same kinds of career and educational success as you and your child's other parent? Across the board, the answer was no. And here's Jennifer, and she says, I'm not worried about downward mobility. I just feel like my kids, they'll be fine. My husband and I, we both went to college, we worked hard, we have a good ethic. I feel like it'll just be passed down. And Nancy, no, downward mobility is not a concern for me at all, actually. I think my husband and I have such a stable environment here, and we both come from families that valued education. So I can't imagine, unless something goes really astray, I don't imagine we will have any major concerns about achieving. So for these families, college and professional careers is just a given. And as Eden describes, graduate school just became the norm. If my husband had it his way, he would go, the son would go to medical school. His family, there's a tradition. His father's physician, big brothers and sisters are physicians. So there's this expectation that we imply that you're going to do something, if not medicine, maybe something else like law or whatever profession. So in these families, like law becomes like the backup plan, the plan B, which is sort of interesting. So these parents were confident that their children would sort of naturally conform to their family's intergenerational patterns of educational attainment and professional success. And they were subjectively secure about their kids' future. And in this regard, their sentiments differ markedly from the middle class anxieties that consume many parents and that have been documented by sociologists in the literature. And I'm certainly, and my co-authors, we're not arguing that the other literature is wrong in any way. It's just that in a crucial sort of difference in this sample is that the parents I interviewed sit at really impressive tales of family attainment, you know, and this in fact may ward off any kind of insecurity or anxiety that has been so well documented in the parenting literature by others. At the same time, it's interesting. So some families, you know, just see it as a given and certainly did have their eye on medical school or law school or done something else. But there was something about coming from a sense of security and peace of mind that sort of loosened the parameters of success for other families. And so some of my interviewees would say things like, you know, because we're so financially so secure and the fact that my kids are going to inherit a lot of money, they're going to be fine, that, you know, if my son or daughter wanted to become a writer or an athlete or a musician, they really can't think about doing that, like, and they'll be okay. So here's Bernadette, and she says, they're very lucky boys and that they are financially very well taken care of. So they're in a position where they really can choose to do whatever they want, not dependent on income. So we try to relay to them that they can go that route, pre-med or law, if they want to, but if they're doing it just because they want to make a lot of money, there are probably easier ways to make a lot of money instead of being a doctor these days. We've given them a huge latitude, I think, a healthy latitude, and that it's a gift really to say, you know, you really can just follow your interests. So I think that financially they're in a funny boat where they'll have a good quality of life, whatever they do. At the same time, I want to be clear that while the expressions of ease did not mean they didn't do all the things that we would associate with concerted cultivation or intensive parenting. It's just the logic that drives it is a bit different in these families. So the families that I spoke to do all the things that we would expect. This has been well documented in the literature in terms of enrolling their kids in a gazillion lessons, sports, language, academic enrichment. Other just refers to one-offs, like one of the families put their kids in Girl Guides. Another one had a child in a debate club. But again, very busy families, busy children. They were also able to compensate for various challenges that their children might have had and shore up those gaps. So here's Julia, and Julia's children were in baseball and swimming lessons and Hebrew school and a reading program. And her oldest son, she describes that he has dyslexia, and so her child also had a homework helper and a tutor. I won't read this quote, but this was, again, very common amongst the families that I spoke to. They were also very clear that they made a concerted effort to really understand their children's social world. So their children's friends, the school context, you know, they were in the school, they got to know their children's friends and their parents as well. So it was really important to be there for their children. And part of it was because, you know, if there is a problem, they would be more effectively, be able to more effectively intervene. And they were also able to help their children make better choices about the friends and school and so forth. And so they would say things like, you know, if there's a problem, you're kind of aware of the dynamics already. So even though the parents that I spoke to often had very busy professional lives, they described doing things like volunteering, going on school trips, and so forth, and having constant communication with their child's teacher, and developing a really good relationship. So Terrance is a really nice example of this in terms of right from preschool right into the college years. Terrance had 4 children, 2 wives. He was divorced from the first one. This is not a sister-wife situation here. And he describes, you know, his children going to high-quality preschools, including some of his children went to the farm, which is a pseudonym. And I looked up the farm recently. It literally is a farm. There's like goats and sheep and everything like that. Very expensive. So I wish I had checked years ago when I conducted the interviews, but currently tuition is $22,000 US per year. And that's just for a half-day program, 8 to 12. If you want your kid to go to the rest of the day, it's more money. But very expensive. But some of his kids went to the farm. He also enrolled his children into private school. And he also describes, in some cases, he had to sort of shore up a gap. So he describes his 3rd child, who's a sophomore, being a late talker, had an enormous speech impediment, and he literally couldn't talk. And so they went to speech therapy. This particular child did not go to the farm. This child went to a preschool for special needs. And as Terrance described, if you met him today, you'd never know he had a problem. So they were able to resolve that particular challenge. This is a nice illustration how these parents were there, you know, the importance of being there and being part of the process, even in the college years. So at the time his youngest son, the interview was conducted in the fall, and at the time his son was applying and contemplating college options. So here he describes this. His mother was, I would say, the quarterback on that team, and she had a checklist and a schedule, and she said, okay, this has to be done, and now you have to do this, and now you have to take these SATs, and blah, blah, blah. It went on and on and on. And I was instructed to stay out of it, as I would simply screw things up. And I should say, not because Terrance wasn't perfectly capable of helping his child with the application process, but just because they were concerned that it would stress out the son. The son was already under enough pressure. And he goes on to say, so I would say that my wife and my son and the school college advisor all contributed to names on what you would think of as the master list. And then he eliminated one after the other and maybe added 1 or 2 along the way. But there might have been as many 20 different colleges on the list at one point, and pretty much narrowed down to 3 or 4 over the last couple of months. And he only applied to 1 college for early admission. So if he gets in, he will go. And if he doesn't get in, it was to Stanford, then we'll have a terrible Christmas vacation. So I'm excited to find out what happened to his son. Okay, and then finally, these families were also to provide lifelong safety nets. Tuition, moving expenses. If there was an economic downturn, they talked about being able to help their child retrain. And of course, the fact that their children would inherit money. So here's Bernadette again, where she says, you know, they stand to inherit a lot of money, so they will not have to worry about, we don't live a fancy life, but we have a nice house, we don't have a mortgage, we don't have to worry about money. My oldest son is off on his own for the first year of college. He pretty much lives like he always lived. He has an allowance every week, and he doesn't overspend it, and he doesn't abuse the credit cards. So I think they will have a good quality of life for children. The question is, as a parent, what we want for them is to find something they can sink their teeth in and make them really happy professionally, whatever that is. Okay. So in conclusion, you know, there has been, of course, a lot of pressure and demand for post-secondary, and this expansion, along with open competition, has been theorized to fuel a lot of competition and anxiety. Well, of course, why? Because higher education is a really critical pathway for both upper mobility as well as class maintenance for others. However, among the families that I spoke to, we have to consider that there has been a lot of stability at either ends of the income distribution. And currently, more well-off students, as people like Raj Chetty and others have written about, they're more likely to attend these more selective schools, get into better colleges, and so forth. And so what we do in this paper is we introduce the concept of predictable stability to capture this type of logic that can emerge from among families who have enjoyed multi-generational success in open contest mobility systems, as well as to flag their ability to fortify the glass floor that protects their children from falling in the first place. So in conclusion, you know, quantitative research has been able to document the enduring role of social class in shaping educational pathways and outcomes. And I think what qualitative research can add is helping us articulate the kinds of parenting logics that can emerge in this type of ecosystem. So the next step is I have received a short grant. I will be conducting another round of interviews in this area and in these two areas once I get through research ethics. And I also want to follow up with the original families. I really do want to start to build these family trees of education and careers. Again, this was not part of my original intention for the initial round of interviews. So I want to find out, where are they now? Did Terrance's son go to Stanford? I mean, these are all burning questions, because what's interesting about these families, at least for some of them with the older children, is that they may be parents at this point, and I think it'd be really neat to follow up with the children of my original interviewees, at least some of them, to find out what their parenting philosophies are and what their hopes and dreams are for their kids. So I'll end there.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Aurini. It was so interesting and so rich information in it. I'm very interested to definitely hear, you know, what you will find the next iteration. So perhaps we should really definitely keep in touch and you'll be invited again. But that being said, I'm pretty sure that we will have a lot of, you know, things that, you know, try to, you know, have questions and stuff. So I'd like to open the floor to the question session. So everyone, you can use the raise hand function by using tapping into this participant window, or you can use the chat box. Okay, now I thought Wolfgang, I thought you raised the hand, but then you're pricing and then have a question. So yeah, so please unmute yourself.
I did applaud, but I meant to raise my hand. Thanks, Janice, that was great. Two questions, if I may. The first one, how would these families define downward mobility? He's not getting into Stanford, but another elite school. Downward mobility. And the second one, did you talk to the kids tonight? And if you did, like, how stressful an experience is that for them? And I'm thinking of, you know, all the students we teach at even our non-elite universities who want to get into law school and God knows what, and how the amount of stress they're dealing with. So that would be, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. it's interesting. So I didn't present the quotes here, but some parents were very clear that for them, downward mobility, so for example, if their children became a teacher and a scientist, which were two of the examples that were given, which for them, that would mean that at least financially, they would experience downward mobility. The parents were very clear that in their definition, that was not downward mobility if they enjoyed career satisfaction. If they were professionally fulfilled, they are clear, this is not downward mobility. And again, in the context of being able to help children buy homes, move, those kinds of things. They did, however, note things like, you know, if their child became a scientist or a teacher, you know, yes, they've kind of gotten used to the good life. And so it might be difficult when you come from a home that can, you know, afford a nanny and a housekeeper, and you can rent, you know, a summer vacation home and those kinds of things, that it might be a bit of you know, a bump in the road, but they were very clear that professional satisfaction was more important than making a lot of money. But again, in that context of, you know, these are families that could help their kids with things like putting a down payment on a home and that kind of thing. So, and in terms of the children, no, I did not speak to the children, just the parents.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now I have hands raised by Emily Orr.
Hi, thanks for a really great talk. I was wondering, when you talk about the being there for kids sort of at school and knowing what's going on, did you find that was a gendered phenomenon? It was mostly mothers, or was it both parents sort of equally invested in knowing everything in their kids' lives?
It was both. In my sample, and I don't have the breakdown right in front of me, I did also speak to fathers. And what was interesting is when I was doing my recruitment, I wasn't looking for either or. I was happy to speak to whatever parent was willing to speak to me. I did speak to a few people together as well, not in the American sample, but in the Canadian sample. And in some cases, like in the case of Terrance and a few others, you had people who were either retired or close to retirement and had fairly flexible schedules, and so had time to actually meet me at a coffee shop in the middle of an afternoon to talk about their children. No, both parents tended to be fairly involved, or at least that's how they describe their role, whether it be talking to the teacher, going on school trips and so forth. And remember to keep in mind that these are people with professional careers. They have more flexibility. They're able to set their own schedules and make those kinds of accommodations. So that's a huge distinguishing factor versus people who are working in more 9-to-5 hourly wage types of jobs. They had a lot more professional autonomy and control over their time and their schedules.
Thanks. Now I have Sean.
Thank you so much. A fascinating talk. I'm wondering if your data allowed you to explore intersectionality in any way. Did you have upper middle class racialized minorities in your sample, same sex, same gender couples? Who were your couples?
Yes. It's not large enough. I would say that certainly there was a mix in terms of ethnicity and race. I can't give you a breakdown. I did actually do a demographic survey, which I distributed to parents, and that data is safely tucked away in my office, and I've only been back to campus one time. Waterloo has been quite strict in terms of being allowed to be on campus and so forth. But there certainly was a mix. I did not have any same-sex couples. Again, the way I sampled, that wasn't part of my sampling criteria. I was just looking for people within particular neighborhoods who had children. I did have two single parents. One, it was a situation of divorce, and the other was a mother who used a sperm bank, and she had twins. And so she was among the few parents who actually said that downward mobility might be a concern of hers, but it was more in the context of the fact that as a single parent and with twins, just the roll of the dice that she had conceived twins, that she had every expense is doubled. And she was also, you know, as a single parent, you know, she had to do all the drop-offs, the pickups, the childcare, everything. But I actually followed up with her to just get some more background information, and currently she is a partner at her law firm, and her children are both in college. So things have worked out. But no, regrettably, and I should say that for the kinds of qualitative research projects that I normally work on, this is a very small sample. Most of my, and I think that once I get back in the field and collect more data and increase my sample size, I'm hoping to get more diversity in terms of the family formations and so forth. Most of my projects, qualitative projects, are 150, 200. So this is a very small sample. And I was hoping to do more data collection this year, but as I mentioned, I've experienced a little bit of a hiccup with research ethics, and the light's at the end of the tunnel, but I will get there. I will get back out there and collect more data.
Thank you. So next, I thought I saw Anna raised hands, but do you have?
I did. Sorry,
Okay,
I
great.
actually wanted to ask also the question that Sean posed. I was in particular interested, even if you don't have the data, I was particularly interested in the whether you had Black parents and Black families, just because of the crazy wealth gap that exists, and sort of a lot of that stability that white families can rely on, and that long-term academic elite background oftentimes is not present for Black upper middle class families. And so whether you have enough to even just make any sort of informal assessments about what you saw.
Yeah, well, people would talk about, just in the context of the interview transcripts, and I've certainly gone through them more recently, people identified either them or the other parent that I didn't perhaps meet, maybe coming from China or Southeast Asia. I did not have any Black families in my sample. And I should note that, you know, I tried to do a very systematic sample in that, you know, I did not rely on, nor do I subscribe usually to using a convenience or snowball sample. None of my parents came from other people. They were literally just taken off of a list based on that list that was generated by the marketing company of people with children in my selected zip code and postal code area. But the areas that, the area which was around, I think I can say safely without breaching ethics, I was a postdoc fellow at Harvard, so it was in one of those communities in general, and it is a racially diverse area. I'd be curious to see when I go back how things have changed and whether or not I'll be able to capture African-American families in my sample.
Thanks. Now we have 3 more hands and a lot more to come. So let's go to Isu.
Hello. Thank you for your presentation. Really enjoyed it. And just gonna lower my hand. And also, I just want to say that, like, the pictures you showed us, the 2 neighborhoods and 2 houses, were really great, because that really gave me a sense of the neighborhoods. So question I'd like to ask you is that sort of connecting your study to school choice, which is sort of area of my interest. And I was wondering if you could speak about that topic in terms of, specifically, I guess I'm interested in knowing about like what types of schools those parents chose for their children, but also perhaps talk a little bit about the locations of those schools as well, because it was really interesting that you sampled the families within particular sort of geographical areas, and whether these families chose schools within, like, sort of, you know, close where they live, or they traveled far to, you know, take their children to, like, better schools. So yeah, so any of those related topics, if you have any data, that would be really great. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I invite my co-authors. I should say I should invite my co-authors if they want to chime in at any point or correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe 9 of the families discussed sending their children to private schools for various reasons. So some cited things like, wanting to send their children to a Jewish school, or wanting to ensure that their children wouldn't slip through the cracks, or they use that kind of language. But other parents talked about specifically buying a home in that area because it had a great reputation and great schools.
Right.
So I'm sure you're familiar with, like, I think it's Goyette, Leroux and Goyette have written about choosing homes, choosing schools.
Yeah.
So these are families who can afford homes in areas that have terrific schools, and a few parents actually said, we selected this area because of the terrific schools, and if we don't like the schools, we'll just move.
Right.
And they have the money to do that, so that's certainly an option. And so, these are people that could probably afford private school. For those parents that sent their kid to the local public school, but they were able to avoid those costs just by their ability to buy a home in a terrific neighborhood that has a great tax base, that can afford, to hire the best teachers and all this kind of stuff, right? So, yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks. Next, we have Rachel Michaelis.
Thank you so much for the talk. I'm really interested in how these families think of or talk about money and their resources with their kids. So it seems like, you were sampling these families based on the income of the neighborhoods, right? But in addition to the income, these families clearly have a lot of wealth. And so different families have different sort of strategies and cultures of talking about money. And so I don't know if you asked any questions about this, or maybe if you could in the future. I think this is a really great study for understanding, like, how parents make decisions about whether they talk about money with their kids, how they do, and in particular these families who are, like, totally okay with their kids becoming a teacher, and about whether the parents are basically telling these kids early on, like, you can be a teacher because you're going to be inheriting X amount of money, and you can basically live off the interest, right? Or what those things are. And so anyway, have you asked about this? Did people talk about it? Because I think it's just such a fascinating study for this topic.
I absolutely love that question. I did not ask them specifically, but I've made a note because that has to be added to my interview schedule. I still haven't received ethics approval for the next phase, so now would be a great time as any. When it came up, it just sort of came up organically in the context of another discussion in terms of how they talked about money, or in, like, Bernadette's case about the credit cards and so forth, and the fact that her child had an allowance, her son had an allowance. But that would be a super question to ask in terms of how they talk about money. I did ask them questions about how they talked about post-secondary, and I also asked them about questions about their own upbringing. So, what were the family conversations about college when you were growing up? How did your parents parent you, and what were the conversations? And funny enough, several of them, again, co-authors, correct me if I'm wrong, talked about how there wasn't these explicit conversations in their homes. It was just like, it's a given. It's just in the air we breathe. It's a given. And so I remember distinctly one interview, he said, like, we didn't actually talk about it because, like, everybody in our social circle was going, all of our cousins or family members. And despite the fact of not having, this sit down at the kitchen table and let's have an explicit conversation, I remember her saying that her and her 4 or 5 siblings all had graduate degrees. Like, it was just, it's part of the tradition, it's part of the legacy, auntie and uncle, everybody just does it, right? It's a given.
Yeah, it would be so cool if, like, along with those conversations about education, about, like, how families were going to pay for them, whether, like, kids were expected to pay for any on their own. If you're ever interested in finding some existing questions about this, there's a really great study by some business school professors called The Millionaire Next Door about families that save a lot or have a lot of wealth, and they have a series of questions that they've asked in focus groups, and
yes,
able to compare against their sample.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for that. That's terrific. I should be asking those kinds of questions. Yeah,
You have a great study.
Yeah.
Thanks. Next, we have Cajun.
Hi, thanks so much for this presentation, Janice.
Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. So I had a question about, could this finding of the predictable stability logic be kind of not simply a product of their exact class status, but maybe also the kind of very progressive political climate of this neighborhood in Boston? And I don't know exactly what year you conducted your interviews, but if it's kind of post-Occupy Wall Street era and maybe in an era of the prominence of politicians like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, like, could they feel the need to kind of acknowledge their class privilege to you? So I think I'm asking not only about like social desirability bias and are they being honest and are they concealing their possible anxiety, but also do they kind of genuinely believe as progressives that their kids are more secure than someone with a similar class status who lives in or has different political beliefs?
That's a really good question, and that's why I want to go back to this area. I'm going back to the same neighborhoods. They still enjoy the same characteristics, so I've checked on that. I conducted these interviews between 2006 and 2008, and so obviously a lot has changed, right? We didn't have like the housing crash and the economic crash. We didn't have COVID. So whether or not these parents are still kind of as cool about, you know, their security and everything's going to be okay for their kids, it'll be interesting to see whether or not only the parent, going back to the parents and maybe their children to talk to them about how they conceptualize the future, but as well as a new batch of parents. So I think that's a very good question in terms of whether or not these parents just felt the need to sort of signal to me that, you know, we don't care about money, our children can experience some downward mobility, it'll be okay. That should be that will be very interesting. So that's a great question.
Thanks. Now we have a question from Mritika.
Thank you, Janice, for the presentation.
Hi, nice to see you.
Yeah, nice seeing you again. So I just have a question about, like, so most of your people in your sample, like the parents, they seem to have, like, you know, MA, PhD, BA, things like that. They have high educational achievement. However, I'm looking into research where there is a gap between post-secondary institution and the labor market, especially when new graduates transition, especially people like graduates in the like non-STEM field, whether it's social science, humanities. So the parents who, although like they seem to not be concerned, but some parents who, despite having high educational background, like were they ever like concerned that maybe my kids are gonna do BA, MA, or get their education but not be able to secure the job in the labor market when they do transition?
According to them, no, they were not concerned about that at all, including those parents who did have some children in college or at the application stage, at least again, according to what they told me. Now who knows, maybe as Kane pointed out, maybe they were just trying to signal their progressive values. Who knows, right? Now I did not ask them in terms of what their political orientations or beliefs were, but that could be another question to add to sort of contextualize the data a little bit more. But again, the interviewees were fairly secure about their ability or their children's ability to successfully transition from post-secondary into the labor market. And if not, they had the resources to catch them and to support them, and to, you know, they were a soft place to fall. So that's that notion of like, you know, being able to provide your child with a lifelong safety net, which again is a pretty nice thing, you know, to have that soft place to fall. So,
thank you.
Thanks. We are almost time, but then I have one more question. So this is going to be the last question. Stephen.
Hi, Janice.
Hi.
This follows up from Ratika's question. I'm curious, beyond creating a social safety net, did these parents at all talk about, or were any questions asked about the snow plowing of the children into the future? So parents, for example, being the ones to secure their jobs, using their own connections to get their children jobs.
I did not specifically ask that, but that would be another terrific question to ask for sure. I did ask questions about, can you, have you ever intervened in your child's school? Have you ever questioned a grade? Have you ever, had to go and talk to the principal about something? Tell me what that was like. Paint a picture for me, and so forth. And certainly the parents did that. Of course, they're always very justified in why they went to or question a grade or whatever. And then, in some cases, obviously, seeking out resources or other kinds of things that their child might need in the process. But that would be a terrific conversation, particularly if I'm able to go back to those parents. Now, again, with the benefit of time, I can then follow up and find out where their kids are. What role did they play, not just in terms of the movement in the education system, but the movement from college to the labor market. So I'm really hoping to be able to follow up with families, and I've already started hunting them down on like LinkedIn and stuff like that. So I've already started stalking them, and some of them have been actually very nice and getting back to me and so forth. But that's a terrific question. So thank you.
This is exciting research, so congratulations and best of luck going forward.
We'll see if I can get through research ethics. We'll see.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Aurini. It was an excellent talk, and thank you everyone for joining. And then now I'm going to get it back to Patrick.
So just to wrap up, since we're at time, again, thank you very much to Dr. Aurini for joining us, and for everyone else who joined us, and for the really interesting conversation. Again, this is our last colloquium of the year, and so I want to thank everyone for joining us throughout the year. You can find the recordings of many of our talks posted onto our website. This one will be posted hopefully by next week. I also want to give 2 special shout outs to Amy for her gracious help in coordinating all things tech and for leading the advertising charge, and then to Gail as well for her help managing many of the logistics. And one final announcement, the university is also sponsoring a NEST talk with Dr. Marcy Carlson later today at 2. So go enjoy your lunch and then join us again. But again, thank you so much, Dr. Aurini, for sharing your research with us.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for all of you showing up on a Friday at the end of the term. It's very nice of you. Thank you.